Hello and welcome to the Oxford German Classic Podcast. My name is Santhia Velasco Kittlaus and I'm a graduate student in the Subfaculty of German here at Oxford. I also coordinate this year's Oxford German Classic essay competition. I'm excited to host today's podcast to talk about this year's text, Der Heizer by Franz Kafka. And I'm really happy to have Professor Barry Murnane as my guest today. Hello Barry,
Nice to be
thanks
here.
for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me.
You're Associate Professor of German, Fellow of St. John's College, and also the co-director of the Oxford Kafka Research Centre, so you're really an expert on Kafka.
Maybe a bit, anyway. It's maybe a little bit.
Whereabouts are you from, and how long have you been at Oxford?
So I've been here probably longer than I realise. I've been in Oxford for 10 years. Originally, I come from Ireland, from the Republic of Ireland, and I studied in Trinity College in Dublin, and then I did all my PhD work in the German system and had my first jobs in Germany. So I've lived in places like Göttingen and Freiburg and Halle in Germany, and then I moved over here, as I say, 10 years ago to work here. And this was the first time I ever became a Germanist. I was a comparative literature scholar, so somebody who looks at different literatures alongside each other. And I studied English and German in that order, so I was always more of an English person. And coming here was kind of the first time I ever really became a proper Germanist, I think.
Through having been to Germany, is that right?
Well, no, more because the place here told me I had to be a Germanist.
Oh, interesting. And how do you feel about German literature, as this essay competition is an opportunity to engage young people with German literature, and it might be the first encounter for them to read, in this case, Kafka.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the first encounter I ever had with German literature was even in translation. So it's kind of, I think it's just important. Literature is important, whether it's in translation or whether it's in the original. It's important as a way of, I think, kind of opening up horizons to how other cultures think and how other cultures think about themselves and write about themselves. It's just a really excellent kind of route into understanding mindsets in other countries. So it's not just about language, it's actually about understanding mentalities and things. And that's always been the approach I've taken when I've been comparing works from different countries as well.
I love that. This is how I feel about reading and what keeps me coming back to reading. And what is your area of expertise in your current research?
So I'm working on a thing called world literature right now. It's an idea of a kind of it's an idea that emerges with a German writer called Goethe in the early 19th century, but it's kind of become a much more popular in recent years to do with post-migration, with migration around the world, with globalization, that we have a kind of a literature that isn't bound to nation states, that isn't bound to particular nationalities. And I suppose that's linked in a way to Kafka as well, because Kafka, obviously, as a Jew, German-speaking, growing up in Prague, surrounded by Czech speakers, and then also kind of growing up in Prague, which first of all belonged to Hungary, then belonged to the Czechoslovak Republic. You know, it's had and now obviously the Czech Republic as a different version of the same space. You know, he's a writer he runs across various different kind of cultural boundaries, various different kind of national boundaries as well in the end. And I think that type of writer, Kafka, could very much be a kind of a world literature writer, I suppose.
I agree. This is an aspect why I keep coming back to reading Kafka, as he's very open to several perspectives. Do you remember your first encounter with Kafka and why you keep coming back to reading him?
Yeah, I do. And he's actually probably the reason why I became a literature scholar, and then probably also the reason why I'm doing the job I'm doing now. I remember when I was about 15 or 16, so around GCSE time, I guess in Ireland it was called something differently. I had an English teacher who saw me looking around to try and figure out what I wanted to do. So I was very good at physics and maths. I was actually much better at physics and maths and kind of science subjects than I was at literature. But he saw me looking around and he'd obviously seen something in me, and he gave me this collection of Franz Kafka's published short stories in Oxford University Press, the Oxford Classics collection. And he just gave it to me over the summer one time. And I remember sitting down, opening up the page, and the very first story I read was actually the Heizer in translation. So the Stoker, it's called in the English translation. And I remember just reading the first 2 pages of this and having no idea what is going on here. It was written in English, so it wasn't the words that were being used. It was just the absolute disorienting experience of not being able to figure out what's going on. And that's something that's kept me with Kafka the whole time. It's kind of this idea of not properly understanding what's happening, this idea of kind of, a multiplicity of different meanings, of texts going in various different directions, whatever way we want to take them sometimes, not being able to pin down what was happening, there not being one single meaning. And that absolute kind of just unbelievable kind of effect of not knowing what's happening just got me hooked.
And it can be scary.
Absolutely, and I mean but I kept on coming back to this question of wanting to figure out what it was meaning for me, wanting to figure out how to contextualize it. So if we start with that experience, what do? We start to look at history sometimes to try and figure out how we orient it in itself, or we can look at religion, or we can look at questions around gender, or we can look at social history and things. It was really just trying to find different approaches to that. That I think it was such a rich text, and now that we get to chat about this for a podcast, it's also kind of really, really interesting because it's coming back to this source text.
Yeah. And I love to hear that you read it at school as a student at the same age as our listeners today, and you spent a summer reading their Heizer as they will be doing, so it can be fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it takes a particular person who wants to read it, and for whom it can be fun.
Yeah.
But if you're starting to do this, and if you're already engaging with it, it's a really great way of accessing Kafka's works. Also, a really great way of accessing kind of German-speaking modernism and trying to understand kind of German-speaking modernism alongside kind of works in English that we might be more familiar with sometimes.
Talking about modernism, this keyword, it's a big word. We've all have it in our minds somewhere. Can you explain to us what it is? What do you understand about the modern era, and how does Kafka play into that?
Yeah, well, huge question. So I mean, there are different ways, I suppose, of understanding modernism. I think one of the easiest definitions that I think is still kind of valid to a certain extent is a definition that's based on an American poet called Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound has an idea about the task of kind of modernist literature is to make it new, he calls it. A literature that makes it new is something kind of, and literature, modernist literature is literature that's kind of typically taken, we say, to have been written between, say, 1890 and the Second World War. And in this period, we get a lot of writers who try to do precisely that. They try to find new ways to write, new ways to express themselves, whether that's in poetry, whether that's in prose, whether it's in drama. And in this kind of attempt to try and find a new way of writing or a new way of speaking in literature, it's a response to changing conditions of the world in which these writers are living, I think. So if we think about modernism, I think one way to think about it is modernism is a way of trying to react to life and the changes of living in the modern era. And the modern era we typically take to mean kind of something that's, like modernity. We're thinking around industrialization. We're thinking around urbanization. So, new factories, the explosion of cities across Europe, across the Western world in particular. We're thinking in terms of kind of transportation, changes in transportation, whether that's because of trains fundamentally changing the way that we experience traveling through the world, or whether it's trams fundamentally experiencing the way we travel through the world. Other things that are important are things like psychology. People like Sigmund Freud, kind of introducing models of how we think and of how we behave, or kind of our understandings of who we are as people that change. We no longer think of ourselves as just being kind of conscious, kind of thinking rationally the whole time, but we're kind of bundles of mess and meat and kind of, and desires and things that we can't get a hold on. And that idea of kind of not just being a kind of a simple, like a simple thinking subject starts to challenge people, and people try to find new ways of expressing this. And I think, some of the ways that they try to find it, I mean, maybe one of the most common ways or one of the most common features that I think we think of is something like the stream of consciousness. So the idea of a text that's written entirely from the way that individuals are, kind of thinking to themselves, as though our voices in our own heads, essentially, trying to respond to that. Where Kafka fits into that is slightly kind of problematic, because Kafka finds his own way to fit into this. Kafka, on the one hand, says that some of his favorite writers are from 19th century, so he's actually kind of slightly old-fashioned in his tastes sometimes, like realist novels, like people like Dickens, for example, is one of his favorite writers. But on the other hand, we also find him responding to this life and modernity in very real ways. So if we think about about the Heizer, in particular, what do we see? We see a character who has grown up in Europe, but is now capable of traveling or being made to travel all the way across the world on a steamship. That's a level of global kind of transition and global life that wouldn't have been thinkable in that sense kind of 150 years previously. We then also see him kind of in the text right at the start, kind of rolling into New York Harbor, and the sense of height, the sense of scale, the masses that we have there. There's also this kind of telling passage when he's in the captain's office later on, and he's looking out a window, and all the traffic going by, all the boats sailing past, just the speed of everyday life. Or also in the captain's office, where all the telegraph cables and the phones and things are kind of coming together. All of these things, technology, speed, movement, transport, that all defines what the modern era is, and that's some of the ways in which it finds a footprint, I guess, particularly in this text, but in Kafka's text more generally.
So the space in which this text is set reflects the era and how people feel about it as well?
Yeah, I think very much. I mean, one of the ways in which I think that we can see how people's movement in space impacts on people is actually the way that Kafka narrates the story. So if we just read the start of the, I'll just read it now. Even if we just read the first few lines of the story. Als der 17-jährige Karl Rossmann, der von seinen armen Eltern nach Amerika geschickt worden war, weil ihn ein Dienstmädchen verführt und ein Kind von ihm bekommen hatte, in dem schon langsam gewordenen Schiff in den Hafen von New York einfuhr, erblickte er die schon längst beobachtete Statue der Freiheitsgöttin wie in einem plötzlich stärker gewordenen Sonnenlicht. There's a lot that's happening in there that's kind of really interesting to think about. It's a third-person narrator, yeah. So we're thinking about Karl Rossmann kind of as an heir, as in the third person. But actually, something's happened here, because over the course of this first passage, we've actually slipped into Karl Rossmann's perspective, right? So erblickte he saw, wie in einem plötzlich stärker gewordenen Sonnenlicht. So it's kind of, we've moved into how he's seeing, how he's experiencing the world. And that type of kind of, we call that focalization. So we've got a third-person narrator, but it's focalized through to Karl's perspective. A lot of the time in Kafka's works, it's precisely that type of individual experience in a space that we see. And if we follow that kind of experience, if we look to the next couple of lines where he sees the statue, with a sword, but without the scales that you would expect from like justice or something, it's clear that this is a kind of an experience of space which is threatening to him, that he's following up on. And I think we can follow that through the entire chapter. There's kind of where he feels slightly empowered, he's experiencing the space differently. Where he feels disempowered, he's feeling the space differently. So compare, for example, when he's in the cabin with the Heizer himself, and he feels kind of at home all of a sudden, and the atmosphere changes there. But then put ourselves in his position when he's standing in front of the captain and kind of the assembled masses there, also looking out through the window at this space that kind of seems to be impossible for him to process. All of a sudden, he starts to feel, kind of small and question himself, and kind of, the interpretation of events that he had with the Heizer is that the Heizer had been wronged. He starts to feel less secure about this again. So absolutely, I think that's one of the ways the text works in order to show us the way that this space impacts on people, the way that modernity impacts on people too.
So Karl Rossmann is quite an interesting character. So he's really young, but at the same time, as you say, if I get you right about this, is that it's not only his young age, which we can feel, but also the time that was really confusing through his gaze on things.
Yeah, I mean, I think this becomes clearer in the rest of the novel, and I know we don't want to talk about the rest of the novel too much. This becomes clear in the rest of the novel because we actually see him arriving in America and see what happens. But already here, I think, is kind of this, think about how he walks down into the ship and kind of loses kind of orientation all of a sudden. That's an element where we could start to see this. He gets lost in the passageways. He can't imagine why he didn't see this particular passageway before. He'd never come across this. Or think about when he's walking with the Heizer to the captain's office, and there's a comment about how this part of the ship must have been saved for the richer people. So there's an element of kind of class that comes in here. He is a kind of a lowly person who's just kind of emigrating from Prague, or forcibly being emigrated from Prague, or from Europe, is not allowed access to this type of area because he's not rich enough or powerful enough to read that. So we do kind of see the way that he moves through space being, impacting in very real ways and telling us kind of things about class, things about structure, things about technology as much as anything else.
Wow, thank you. Do you have a different experience reading the Heizer now than you had a couple of years ago, or when you read it the first time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. I've written in my PhD, my qualification to be doing the job I'm doing now, I suppose. I've written about the way that Kafka engages with technology and looking at kind of stories he's written about trains, looking at stories he's written about also about being in Paris, things that are written around the same time actually as the Verschollen. I've looked at this type of material in quite some detail, but one of the things that I've become more and more interested in is precisely this kind of personal impact. So I do read it in very different ways to how I did. Every time I read the text, I see something slightly different in it.
I agree. I feel like this as well. Yeah.
And for example, I mean, one of the things which I've seen differently in this right now is the weird role that women play in this text. For example, in this particular passage, they're only mentioned kind of twice almost.
They're
really
fragmented.
But they're
almost.
really fragmented.
Yeah.
And so we've got Johanna Brummer back at home, who seems to kind of seems to be a figure who is interesting only in relation to her relationships with other men in the text, for example. So we only find out what people say about her. All of a sudden, this kind of we hear supposedly that the uncle Jakob has received a letter from her. Why would he have received a letter from her? What's the kind of, so women seem to be kind of involved in these kind of power structures, they seem to be involved in these kind of gender dynamics. That's something which, when I was writing about the technology, didn't particularly interest me too much. But thinking through these questions of identity, thinking through these questions also of gender identity or national identities or ethnic identities, that's something which kind of comes across, and I think we're much more kind of likely to be thinking about now as identity politics become much more serious, much more important to the type of work that we're doing.
And the letter you mentioned is quite interesting, as it's the only time Johanna Brummer actually gets a voice in this text.
Yeah.
And using a letter as a device in a story like that is kind of Kafkaesque as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's weirdly kind of, I mean, we'd call it self-reflexive. So it's kind of, it's like when a play about, a play in a play is, in a kind of a dramatic context, it's weirdly self-reflexive. But on the other hand, we actually don't hear her voice necessarily. It's the uncle telling us about a letter where she's written. And so there is, again, that kind of element of her being disempowered. But oddly, I mean, in a sense, so Karl Rossmann has a voice. He is capable of speaking, but he's also not empowered by speaking a lot of the time. Quite the contrary. I mean, if we think about the way that he performs in the captain's office, he blows himself up and gives a kind of a speech defending as a 16 or 17-year-old boy, and all of the time everybody else in that office knows his backstory. So it's kind of there is a kind of a level of him having agency, but that agency actually being taken away from him kind of it's a relatively common experience in this entire novel, but we can already see it happening here in the Heizer too.
Would you say he's haunted by his past?
I mean, I wouldn't. He's certainly traumatized by something, and it does seem to find it difficult to escape from that. Whether he's actually haunted by it or not is a different story. But he's certainly. I mean, one thing is we don't know what happened at home with Johanna Brummer. We get competing versions of what's happened with him. But one thing that we can absolutely take from the start of the text is that this experience wasn't a pleasant experience for him. And so that's the kind of the sexual dimension, and that wasn't kind of pleasant for him. But then also being banished from home for something for which he may not have been responsible for is clearly a traumatic experience. And I think that's probably something where we could start to use this text to think through various different problems around migration today, for example, where we're talking about, without trying to get too political, we're talking about stopping boats, but not thinking about people in the boats. And I think that type of engagement with migration, that type of kind of engaging with trauma, is definitely something which he struggles to move away from. To put a bit of context in that, I think one of the ways in which we can see him not being able to cope with this necessarily is to think about the ways in which he seems to be extremely willing to take on the side of somebody he thinks is the weaker party. So he knows nothing about the Heizer. He knows nothing about the backstory apart from what the Heizer has said, but he's automatically willing to buy into the Heizer's story about having been wronged. And you kind of, okay, so this is somebody who's interpreting the world based on a past wrong that he feels he suffered. And I think so in that sense, if we want to call that being haunted by the past, absolutely. Whether that's haunting in the sense of kind of ghosts and things that we might think of, probably not, but certainly traumatized by it and struggles to get beyond this trauma. That trauma stays a key part of how he's interpreting the world, I think.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been great fun.
Thank you. And for those of you listening, please check our link to our website in the description box below, or just search for Oxford German Classic to find out more about our essay competition. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please check out our other episodes as well. And for now, bye and tschüss.
Tschüss.